And inflation slowing down a bit for the first time since August. Consumer prices jumped 8.3% in April. That's still bad, but below the 40-year record high we saw back in March. Some of the biggest increases were fueled by spiking prices for airline tickets, hotel rooms, and new cars. Joining us now to dig deeper into these numbers and to find out whether we could, have already seen the peak of inflation is David Bieri, Associate Professor of Public Policy at Virginia Tech. Welcome, David.
Good afternoon.
Now, a lot happening this week. Tell us, what is your takeaway from today's numbers?
Well, the takeaway is that it's a mixed bag as always. We have some good news and some bad news. Which one do you want to hear first? I'm sure your viewers want to hear the good news first, which is that, as we've just heard, inflation seems to be slowing down. It's still rising year on year, but the increases are less, at least in broad measures of inflation. The bad news is that the core inflation, when we strip away the volatile prices of fuel and food, is still increasing month on month. And so the guessing game as to how temporary this inflation is will continue for some time to come. And Fed officials are not showing any signs of being less worried.
Yeah, both Democrats and Republicans, they blame each other for inflation. Of course, each party has their own agenda, but has it really been caused by policy or just a perfect storm of circumstances out of American politicians' control?
Well, I once again have to be the two-handed economist on the one hand and on the other hand. For sure, policy conditions and the uniqueness of global conditions both play a really important role. So the war in Ukraine most recently, COVID, of course. There is one thing that is very unique about the American situation, which is amongst developed economies, the US government has chosen over the last 3 years to throw the most money at the COVID problem. And that money is still in the system and is part of an inflation problem that we see now. There is no doubt about it. Now, can we go back in time? Is this the moment to say, told you so? We don't know what would have happened to the US economy, which is, as a reminder, bounced back formidably from COVID, but in part because these $5 trillion cumulatively were spent. This is a quarter of US GDP that the US government has spent on measures that elsewhere look very different. And now we're having to carry the consequences. So is this a bipartisan moment? I don't think so at all. Does policy have a lot to do with it? Of course, the Federal Reserve can only do what it can do, namely with interest rates, but Congress did have the big bazooka out, and now we will have to deal with it.
Yeah, wow, that is interesting. Now, inflation also means that not only are people paying more for goods, but the value of our paycheck is dropping. Companies are already having a hard time hiring. So could this mean that they're also going to have to bump up their budgets to anticipate paying more just to attract employees?
Well, absolutely. And this is the worst part of inflation, the corrosive effect. And then that these effects are being built into future expectations. Not only on this is what we call, this is the true inflation spiral, when wage price inflation happens, when people's expectations, which by the way account for, strangely enough, about half of the inflation that we're experiencing right now. So if we could all not believe in it, about half of the rates would go away. But this is not how human psychology works, and certainly what the reality of our paychecks is. It doesn't work like that. And so this is once that spiral begins to set in, imagine wage contracts are only negotiated every year at most. Rents are only negotiated every year, every 2 years. And so this is how these higher elevated prices are getting baked into the system. And so they'll stay with us for at least 12 to 18 more months for sure.
Wow, absolutely fascinating. A lot of stuff again happening this week, and everyone, just about everyone is affected by this, huh? Right?
Well, absolutely. And people are, everybody is affected by this, but it depends what type of expenditure pattern you have. For instance, if you happen to need to buy a new car, you'll be hit harder. If you have higher expenditures in childcare and elsewhere, you'll get hit harder. If you're a renter versus a homeowner, you'll get hit harder. So the inflation experience of American households very much differs depending on what their situation is and where they live. In the New River Valley, we're relatively protected to some extent from some of the larger increases that we're seeing in big metro areas.
David Bieri, Associate Professor of Public Policy at Virginia Tech, thanks so much for joining us with this conversation this afternoon.
My pleasure.